What happened last week that made you think about your faith and organising?
So last week I was on a public narrative training, which was led by LCN, Leading Change Network. It was really interesting because it was looking at, the story of self, of us, and of now. And a big part of that was working out how to tell my own story. And there was a coaching moment where there was a one-to-one. And one of the questions that was asked is, how are you here now? Why are you wanting to be an organizer for climate justice? I guess I really struggled to answer this question. So I've been reflecting back on the moments in my past that have led me to this point to be sat here having this conversation. And for me, that started when I was in school. I wasn't the most well behaved pupil.
I can believe that.
Yeah, a story many of us know, right? And one of the things that I had was I was quite smart. So I knew how to kind of use my wit. When I was talking in class, the teacher would then put me on the spot and say, well, do you know the answer? And I'd always have the remark back. I knew how to wind people up, and I was struggling with my own emotions and regulating that. And I was at the point of exclusion. I was about to be kicked out of school, but I think the school recognized that I did have a lot of passion and a lot of drive, and that's one of the things that was getting me into trouble was the way that I was speaking and always had something to say. And my religious studies teacher, Mrs. Torino, well, she just provided me an alternative path, right? It was at the point that I was getting into trouble all the time. It was that, or would you like to kind of start a new network? In fact, at this point, it was just a case of, can you be the ambassador for human rights for the school? And this role was a brand new role that I was given. The only purpose of that role was to make an assembly and explain what human rights was.
Oh my God. Did you say yes to the role?
I said yes to the role, yeah. I was too naughty, for them to let me be a prefect or anything like that. So they had to create something else for me, right? Otherwise, I would have carried on making noise in bad ways.
I find that like a very interesting way of phrasing it because it's like I think in many ways when we make noise, when we are led, when we do campaigning, right, it's demonized, it's like seen as this moral wrong. And I think I don't know, like that opens a really interesting question, I guess, around where our voices are coming from and why we're reacting in such a way in the context that we live in. And you know what I mean? Like actually asking, okay, why? What makes that bad? What makes that disruptive? In fact, isn't it necessarily disruptive? I hate the classroom. I think like upon reflection, that was a waste of so much of my life and I'm still really angry. So if anything, I think that's such a valid and important and really like useful starting point for a criticism of what it is that you're supposedly disrupting.
I think that that's certainly how I felt at the time. I wasn't that bothered by school and I was very disruptive. And it was only at the point that another classmate said to me, and this was a friend, and they said to me, you do realize that some of us actually have to listen? It took a minute to sink in. And they shared with me that they were really struggling in that class. And every time that I was acting like the class clown and being quite silly and disruptive, their learning was being held back. And actually, this was at the same point of time that I was given this role as human rights ambassador. And that in itself is starting to think about what other people's rights mean. That person in my class had a right to education, and I was disrupting it. So then you start thinking about this wider kind of network of, well, okay, what does justice mean in our context and in the wider context? What does it mean to stand up for human rights in Stoke-on-Trent? What are the issues that are important for us in our community? But also, where do we connect to wider communities? We were a Catholic school, so we were part of the Edmund Rice network of schools. Edmund Rice was from the 18th century as a Catholic missionary. And he set up schools for poor boys who couldn't access education. And those schools are still about today. There's hundreds of them all across the world. And a brother in India had reached out to our school and explained what he was setting up. It was a campaign called Nine is Mine. This campaign was trying to lobby the Indian government to spend 9% of the GDPR on children's health, education, and well-being. And 9%, that's not a great deal. And that's quite a lot of things to cover. It was quite shocking to us that that wasn't being spent towards children. I just got this role. I was really motivated by this communication from Steve. I really wanted to help him in his campaign. So I took it into the school. And it started off with letter writing. We were going to write some colourful letters saying why we thought it was such an important thing to do. And I realised I was stuck because I had this idea, but how was I going to make it happen throughout the school? So at that point, I knew I needed somebody else. So it went from being a role that I had to being a shared role that had kind of somebody else with me. And then in conversations, we were like, well, this isn't enough. We're both in kind of sixth form at this point. We were 17. We were like, wouldn't it be great if we could get somebody from each of the years to get involved in this campaign. So we opened it up and it became a whole network in our school. And there was somebody from each year group that was representing it. And that's how we got everybody to do letter writing. The year group ambassadors had to go back to their year group, get loads of letters. We collected these and managed to therefore send hundreds of letters as part of this campaign. And the more people that joined, the more creative the ideas got for how we could raise awareness in this. So there was one amazing moment where we gathered everyone outside. We made a shape of a 9 in the playground and took a top-down photo and included that so that they could see how many people were involved in writing these letters, and that went alongside with them. Long story short, that attached with all of the other Edmund Rice schools getting involved and reaching out globally, the campaign was successful. I'm sure there was lots more behind it, but as that was my entry level into kind of organising, and that's what opened my eyes to how people getting together and speaking up about something that they're upset about can make change happen.
That's so interesting. And one of the things that made me think of one particular electoral campaign, just as a side note, is the idea of like giving a job title and like how that is received by a person and what they then do with it, because there's a title involved. And it's just something that was done in the Obama campaign has kind of sat with me a bit. Is there a bit of like shared power in giving a title, or is it disempowering? Because actually, how much power do you really have? Is it an illusion of power to get a job title in the organising context? Sorry, it's a bit of a side note, but it's just when you said ambassador and ambassadors for each year, that's what kind of came to mind.
I think the title helped me at the time because I was still finding my own motivations for why I was doing the work. So, like I said, I was kind of 16, 17 when this role came. I think I got it in my final year of school and then took it into the sixth form, carried on being this role. And there were selfish motivations. I was applying to universities, so I needed something that would look good on my university application. And that is genuinely one of those reasons that did pull me to that role at that point. But doing the role and meeting with people, then realized there was much more deeper to that. And I did want to share that role out, which is why there was then the kind of network of people and it felt much stronger. I think I said to you yesterday, Sasha, I was quite excited to learn that this network still exists. It's still going on and there's still ambassadors from across all of these different schools.
That's really beautiful.
Did you get to do anything with the role after the campaign?
Yeah. So Edmund Rice, as a network of schools, also has an NGO based in Geneva. And I knew that Geneva was a place that I'd be really interested in visiting, the United Nations kind of Human Rights Centre.
Oh, because of the UN?
Yeah, because of the UN. At that point, I was contemplating being a lawyer as well. There was definitely a part of me that was like, okay, this would be a cool job to go down, human rights law or policymaker, or those were the kind of jobs that I was pushed to as a child. I was always told to be ambitious and that I was brainy and that those were the sorts of jobs that I should be doing. So yeah, I knew about the network in Geneva and we wanted to take the role there so that young people who were doing the human rights learning and training and being an ambassador could connect it to something that happens in the wider world. Like, how do we make decisions as, you know, a United Nations network that affect human rights? And we did. I got to go to a UPR, which is a Universal Periodic Review, and a country's put up for a UPR every 5 years or so. And at that point, it was amazing seeing all of the different speakers and putting the headphones on that gets translated into all the different languages. It was so exciting. But over the course of spending a week there and hearing countries like Israel was one of the countries that was there doing their UPR, and hearing what countries were saying back and forth to one another, it felt so performative. It felt so abstract and so detached from the people that I was meeting while we were learning about human rights. There was Brother Jer, who was based in Salford, and he had the Salford Centre for Refugees and Asylum Seekers. And this was the first time I'd ever met somebody who was an asylum seeker because of this role. And having conversations with somebody who travelled for 18 hours in a refrigerator, no idea where they were going at all, pregnant, completely scared, to be met in the UK to kind of the accusation that they chose to come to the UK for a better life, when that just simply wasn't the case. They had no idea where they were going. The stuff that was happening in the UN felt so far detached from those conversations that I was having that I knew in that moment that that was not going to be the job that I actually wanted, and I needed to be connected to people.
Yeah, that's a real light bulb moment, isn't it? When you kind of see that chasm between those elected representative spaces, the parliaments, the kind of UN, the kind of EU spaces that are supposed to be where democracy sits, and seeing and experiencing firsthand that there is such a huge gap between that and what's happening in real life and how it impacts people every day. Do you think that was like the moment that you thought, okay, I think I'm going to be an organizer, or did it take a bit longer?
Yeah, it took a bit longer than that. So, having come up through this very Christian upbringing, and I strayed from my faith multiple times, but it was such a strong thread that I went off to do some work with Tear Fund, which is very much mission work, and also with the brothers in India. I thought that that was perhaps a route that through Christian mission and overseas work, helping people who seemed more in need. I had this whole narrative of like, right, we're really privileged here. And having done the campaign with Brothers Steve and learning about how little was spent on education for children in India, I thought that that was what I needed to go and do. And perhaps there was some white guilt in there of this narrative of heading over to another country and feeling like that's where I could help. And in doing that work, I realized I was very far away from any situation that I could be meaningfully helpful. I didn't know the language that these people spoke. I didn't know the cultural background that they were in. I didn't have little more than a high school education. So what was I going to do? And I had this kind of big dream of chaos, and they were colliding, the dream that I had for my life. And over time is when I started to realize, okay, Stoke's got enough problems of its own too. And that's where I'm from. And I speak their language. I also speak their dialects and slangs and everything in between. It took time to know that organising was what I wanted to do. It really did.
And where does that leave your faith? How would you describe your faith and how it relates to the work that you do now? Having come through and become politically aware through the kind of mission work, really, which can be quite patriarchal and from colonizers.
And very much exclusionary as well. There's no room for other faith systems or beliefs in a traditional Christian faith. Christianity for me is a rock, it's a teaching. It's the story of Christ I find really inspiring. The fact that one person went, why are we following the lawmakers? Why are we not based in situational approaches? Why are we not meeting with people? And principally, fundamentally, is love one another. That is the guiding rule, right? And that's the message that I take with me forward every day. It's finding that teaching underneath. Jesus was an organizer.
Yeah.
Great organizer as well. I mean, look how many people he gathered, and the people that followed him immediately after were also that. They gathered people with food, with love, supported them with what they needed, gave people leadership roles, passed on a network, and look at where we are today. So there's principles in it that keep me grounded, and knowing that there's something beyond the here and now. I think everyone can find that though, right? My personal experience is Christianity. There's this term, John Hick's model of pluralism, which is that there's a big elephant, right? And we're all grasping at the elephant, but we've got different bits. So I've got the tail, it's a bit bushy, but you might have the trunk, and that's a bit more leathery. But we're all reaching for the same thing, which is a better world, a better future, a different path. So that's how I understand my faith. We can all find something that we believe in to get us through.
So I guess there's like some tensions within coming from a specific faith, being Christian. How do you envision creating interfaith spaces in organizing? How does that guide you? Is it important?
I think it's incredibly important to make interfaith spaces. My faith doesn't necessarily present itself externally. People don't necessarily know what faith I have. I don't walk around and say, I'm a Christian.
I had no idea until today.
I remember you telling me in the car about your relationship, how it kind of comes in waves, and I think you phrased it really beautifully then, and I think it would be nice to hear that once again. Yeah.
I mean, it does come in waves. I understand God in a very pluralistic sense. I could be stood on the top of a mountain, right? And you feel the wind hit the back and your spine starts to tremble. Or it's when I'm stood in a crowd full of people and you can see the sense of community and the love that each person shares. The same feeling on the back of my neck starts to happen. And that for me has always been interpreted as when God is closest to me. And those moments are, I find my faith next to me. I don't know if I'm making much sense.
But that's the thing, right? Faith isn't one of those things that necessarily makes like this super logical sense. It's a very emotive, internal feeling. And I think it's something that I feel not in relation to religion, but in relation to some form of spirituality. I think it can manifest in really beautiful ways. There's an element of all of us where our idiosyncrasies are able to be expressed as well, and where we're able to recognize that we're not just like robots following a super logical path and rhythm, as much as I try to perhaps do that sometimes. So yeah, it's okay if it's not coherent, right?
Yeah, and it's okay. And in a way, it's important as well because it gives you space to kind of push back against it. I think I was brought up Catholic. You wouldn't see it in me at all, other than I really like frankincense. I burn frankincense in my house. But other than that, I've pretty much rejected anything I was taught. Although I'm quite proud that my confirmation name is Michael because I wanted an archangel, not the saint. I pick and choose a little bit of the bits that I want to like talk about, but generally like it's not that important to me. But in terms of organizing, the ritual is something that's been important to me as I've grown as an organizer. Do you feel like there's anything in your faith or in Christianity as a whole, or perhaps in your experience of doing the work that you've done, have something we can learn from in our organizing?
Absolutely. And just to pick up on a couple of things that you were saying there, though, as well, that feeling of disconnection from that faith upbringing. I was also raised Catholic and spent some time in mission. Then, when I got to university, I tried so hard to detach from it because I was stepped into very leftist circles where religion had become such an exclusionary thing that it wasn't safe to do so. And it's only in the past few years that I rediscovered my faith and my connection and how I do that. Essentially, religions, a lot of them are storytelling. It's the tales that have been passed on. It's learning how to tell the stories of then and link it to another future, and finding confidence in that voice that guides us and goes with us and trusting in that. And it was through rediscovering my relationship with God that I was able to start writing poetry. That's now a huge part of me, and that's a huge part of my organizing as well, in the sense of the circles that I'm in. My organizing in Stoke to date has been kind of artist based and connecting those circles. So to rediscover my creativity and to trust in the voice that I hear with me. And I'm excited to see where some of this kind of storytelling and poetry and faith-based confidence with that voice will take me.
Something you said has really resonated with me because it's actually something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. It's this conversation about church and state. We have a tradition here where those things are separated. And particularly in like political circles, generally speaking, no one really brings their faith into it. But I was brought up in very different political circles, not necessarily ones in England. There were more kind of solidarity campaigns with global south countries, particularly the ones that my parents were running. Faith and organizing, church and state were not things that required us as political beings to be separate. But that was definitely my experience of political life in the UK. Do you think it's important that we start maybe creating opportunities for faith and organizing, for faith and politics to start reintegrating and dancing with each other again?
Oh, absolutely. And I guess one of the reasons why it's so hard to have allowed them to be in the same space is because of how exclusionary they're seen as. As soon as you say that you're a Christian, are you then excluding a Muslim audience, an atheist audience, or many of the other religions that are represented in our communities? I think it's remembering that it's in the differences that we really flourish and we create something new. It's in learning how to communicate with one another beyond this.
With regards to that relationship between church and state, like I think something we've got to remember as well with spirituality and religion is that it's such a personal thing, it's such a communal thing existing on that local level and that community level. Like I think that's something I certainly love and wish that I had more of. And that's something that people are able to access. And that's how we're able to find spaces to just exist, right? To just be in communion with one another. And that's something that I loved, was just sharing that with my grandma, like going with her and being present with her. And it's just such a beautiful thing. And I think that's where I feel it's so important to remind ourselves that it's at this local level, it's at this community level. That's the whole point. That I think is where it has a super direct, obvious link to the organizing we do, because it's been this vital aspect of human connection. And it's okay to have that in other formats, but I think it's a wonderful avenue and way of linking people that we shouldn't just be dismissing completely, because at the heart of it, we're not trying to exclude people. We're trying to work with people. We're trying to meet people where they're at. And if where they're at is with God, then that's where they're at, and we can still actively create whatever it is we want to create.
I wonder if I could just end on a poem. I've got lots of very explicitly Christian poetry, but most of the work that I ever do publicly is not. But I think maybe if you hear it, you might hear some of those themes in there. So this one's called Times of Change. It was originally part of a rap, but we can do it spoken word as well. Times of change, strange to the eyes. The doors may be closed, but with social ties. We can mobilise and the local rise, and they plug the gap where hunger lies. In times of change, our brains are freezed. We're at home to work, get no release. I thank Earth for air, fresh to breathe in. It's nice to care, but it's blessed to feel it. So in times of change, what will it be? Today we say, let it be peace and respect all whoever we are, because one step together goes far. So in times of change, do not ignore the borders detained. Unlock that door. The world's unjust, but there's one simple cure. Put down hate and love once more.
Wonderful. Well, that's come to a really beautiful end. Thank you.
No problem.
This has been Campfire Stories, brought to you by Breathe. Check out our socials where you can hear directly from our community organisers who are doing the work. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel, and keep up to date with our future episodes.